Hello. It's really nice to see so many people in the room. Thanks for joining me. This is, other than a couple of media appearances, this is actually the first time I'm actually talking about this book, other than to my family, only to my husband and to my walls in my house. So I'm really thrilled that so many people are here. It really shows that there is so much love for Chinatown, which is one of those neighborhoods that needs a lot of love and appreciation. And I think all of us in here actually know that. So I think Andy and I have a fun conversation today. We're going to talk about childhood memories and also about Chinatown, but also what it means to us, but also what it means to grow up in Vancouver and especially East Vancouver and how it's changed in the last couple decades, or actually number of decades. And so I'm going to start us off with kind of giving a bit of a talk about what I've actually learned on this journey. And as Jorge mentioned, I'm not actually an artist. I kind of became an artist over the pandemic. And I think that's where people recognize my work. And I think that's where I've also learned that it's never too late to do something creative. And then I'll show some images because I want to show some of my art for those people who haven't seen them. And then I'll do a brief reading from my book. So when you do research on a place like Chinatown, you spend a lot of time asking questions. And you ask questions especially about where are these silences and why are there silences when we look at the history of Chinatown and of certain places and of certain people and their experiences, and why they have been overlooked in history. It's almost as if people who look like me or who grew up like me have never been here. And so one of the benefits of a book like this is the opportunity to actually look back in history. And those who are actually curious enough or patient enough, you can almost see how these certain patterns are there when we look at history, and often how history is defined and what important events were defined are often defined by those who can define them. Historically, the privilege of actually recording history and major events and actually writing them into books and even actually having them published, especially here in North America, have historically been done by people who don't look like me, and often who grow up with certain privileges that I never had growing up. And even though they probably did their best to represent people who look like me or different groups in society, I can't help but feel that they've actually missed some of our experiences. And so this book that I've put together, full of illustrations and stories and also interviews with the community, it's an attempt to fill part of that gap. It's not the end of the conversation, it's really just the beginning. And I'm hoping that this book will help spark a lot of different conversations about this neighborhood, but also about our identities as people in Vancouver and also our identities as Canadians. So as a researcher myself and as a social scientist, I'm actually not blind to my role as a researcher. And I've had many conversations about the role of research and writing, and also how it's also biased. And often the questions that the researchers ask are cherry-picked. We often leave out what's inconvenient for us, and we often prefer a language and the way of communicating that's actually convenient for us. And so we often leave out certain questions that we never asked, and certain people's stories that because we didn't ask the right questions. And I think this is the benefit of having a book that combines both written history, interviews with the community, which played a part of this in this book, but also a combination of visual aids like illustrations and photographs. It helps to enhance and add to the story, and also add to the bits and pieces of the written text that I haven't written or other people haven't written, because you can interpret visuals in the way you want to interpret them. So combining visual aids with text provides multiple ways to help us interpret history and what certain places mean, but also captures parts of history that haven't been recorded by other people. The Chinatown that you see today and the closure of shops and the changes due to various reasons, but also the opening of new shops and the welcoming of new life, this isn't new in Chinatown. This is the benefit of being able to actually look back in history and to look at the photographs and look at the illustrations. You start to see this pattern. And we can learn a lot about history, and I don't want to be one of those people who preach that famous quote by George Santayana that says, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Because I've learned through writing this book that how we understand the past is already flawed, because the past remains incomplete until we have a diverse representation of different voices and experiences. So coming back to this idea of understanding the past, there are plenty of times while I was doing research on this book where I've actually had to pause and question, why does this all sound familiar? Why am I seeing the same things happening elsewhere that happened before? So I could be reading about the anti-Asian riots in 1907, or the reasons for passing the Exclusion Act in 1923, or even the barbecue meats controversy in the 1970s. And each and every single time, I've had to put my book down or close my laptop because I'm seeing similar experiences and events either here in Vancouver or elsewhere, even today in 2025. So I want to share one more lesson that I've learned when doing research about Chinatown. And Chinatown is one of those special places in Vancouver where you can still physically see the past. There is a beauty even in the peeling paint that on the buildings. It's almost like it's a gateway to seeing the layers of history. And it's almost like the melding together of different groups of immigrants and their experiences all into one structure, so to speak. So even walking down Pender Street, I've started to realize what Chinatown says about Vancouver as a city, and also its physical history. It's one place, if you know it enough, you start to notice how the ground actually feels different from day to day, and that there might be different cracks in the sidewalk from one week to another. And I recently learned how there are actually streams and tiny rivers and waterways underneath Vancouver. And this is, even though growing up here, I never actually knew this. And so in Chinatown is one of those places where you can actually feel them underneath your feet. And it teaches us how the growth of a city and how urbanization has displaced its natural beauty. In Chinatown, those cracks in the sidewalk almost symbolizes how the past is trying to reclaim itself. And it's almost like it's saying, I am still here. So if you're not buying the book for me, you should buy it from Madeline Tin's foreword. She wrote this amazing forward in the book, and every single time I read it, I just can't stop crying. It's very personal. It's her own reflection. As some of you might know, she grew up here in Vancouver. But I want to just pull one quote from the foreword, and I think it summarizes the book quite a bit. A building wears all its times, all its generations upon it. Entering, we become aware of, or we remember, or we seek out the existences in whose wake we are living. Those who built these houses, these refuges, this community, we are reminded that everything we are now building and unbuilding is creating the world in which our children and children's children will come to face themselves. And so now I'm gonna grab some. So I'm gonna read a couple pages from the introduction. And I've titled the introduction, If Chinatown Were a Red Balloon. When I think about Vancouver's Chinatown, the first thought that crosses my mind isn't the freshly roasted ducks hanging in the greasy window of a butcher shop on East Pender. Nor is it the vegetable vendor on Kiefer Street who claims his gailan is cheaper, fresher, and crisper than his competitor on Gore Avenue. Nor do I think about the otter who broke into the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Classical Garden and ate the curious fluorescent koi that called the majestic lily pond home. Instead, these days, when I think about Chinatown, I think about a red balloon. It was 1985, and I was 4 when I received a bright red balloon during a regular outing in Chinatown. This balloon was special because it was a gift, and it was red, a color associated with luck, a lucky balloon. My mother and I often wandered through Chinatown's busy streets, ducking into green grocers and meat shops or visiting the herbalist. I loved following my mother through the crowds as she weaved in and out of the stores, picking up various goods, bok choy, ginger, garlic, oranges, bananas, vermicelli, egg noodles, fermented shrimp paste. If I was lucky, we would make a pit stop at Newtown Bakery for an egg tart, or meet with an old friend at a cafe where I'll be treated to a towering glass of red bean ice topped with a scoop of vanilla ice cream. Sometimes we'll visit one of Chinatown's many barbecued meat shops, where we stood in line behind heckling customers as they shouted their orders at cleaver-wielding butchers. The day I received the red balloon, we wandered through the crowds of East Pender and Kiefer like we usually did. It was summer and Chinatown was bustling, buzzing to its own rhythm while the sweet smells of barbecue pork and roast duck scented the humid air. Lyrical dialects filled the streets, each strumming its own tune while vendors bellowed about how cheap and fresh their produce was. With one hand wrapped around the balloon, I followed my mother, my arms brushing against polyester-clad and nylon stocking legs, sticky from the August heat. "Hold on to your balloon," my mother warned. I looked up at the sky, watching the balloon cast its grace against the fluorescent awnings, lined with homemade signs scribbled in black marker, half Chinese, half English, advertising ginseng and chrysanthemum tea. "Let's go," my mother ordered as we weaved through another crowd, my small hand slipping out of hers as I waited for my balloon to follow. The balloon bounced left and right like it had a life of its own, wedging itself between a woman with permed hair and a man with large, thick glasses. I was suddenly alone, smothered by the crowd, suffocated almost, but I felt a sense of relief, of safety, because I had my red balloon. But the beautiful round balloon was too far away, too out of reach as it dangled above my head. I wanted to hold it, to protect it, to make sure it was mine forever. Through a break in the crowd, I caught sight of my mother picking through a mountain of oranges at a produce shop. She lifted one up, frowned at its imperfections, and then traded it for another. She repeated this sequence and filled the plastic bag before disappearing into the store. Fearing that she would leave me behind, I picked up my pace, taking extra measures to protect my balloon. I grabbed the string, pulled the balloon, and wrapped my arms around its delicate, round body. I ran through the crowd to my mother with my red balloon. It didn't take much, a quick squeeze here, a pinch there. I was 4 years old, and I wasn't shy about wedging myself between bodies that wouldn't budge. Seconds later, my balloon, the one I had cherished, the one I wanted to take home to show my baby sister, was no more. It disappeared like it never existed, its droopy, rubbery remnants still clinging to the thin string attached to my wrist, leaving me with a deep sense of emptiness, a void, and shock as I stood there with my arms stretched out. Where had my balloon gone? The bystanders trickled by without even noticing that a part of me had disappeared as if it had never existed. When I was growing up, balloons were a rare commodity in my household. My parents immigrated to Canada in the early 1980s from a village in Guangdong. Their upbringing in China and their working class status in Canada limited their access to celebratory goods like creamy cakes, wrapped presents, and birthday parties crawling with screaming classmates. For immigrants like my parents, Chinatown is a lifeline. Its sights and sounds provide a sense of home, where newcomers could converse with others in the same dialect, access medical and financial services with relative ease, enjoy a Cantonese home-style meal, and buy ingredients to make dumplings or noodles that smelled and tasted like home. My early experiences in Chinatown were through accompanying my mother on her daily errands, socializing with my parents' friends, or visiting my grandmother. Chinatown was not only a social network and a food paradise, but also a place where my mother came alive, where she shed the struggles of an immigrant, where she could be herself as she picked up crumbs of gossip from store clerks, where she flirted with the handsome butcher, and where she complained about the hardships to the herbalist. Now I wonder what happens to someone like my mother when neighborhoods where they once belonged are displaced or disappear, like my red balloon. Thank you.
Waiting for that screen to do bzzz automatically. In the meantime, I want to introduce Andy Yan. Andy's going to be the moderator. He is the City Program Director and Associate Professor of Urban Studies at Simon Fraser University. And he has worked on projects with various cities around the world, and he's received numerous accolades, including a King Charles III Coronation Medal. Let's give it up for Andy.
Thank you. Hello? Hello?
Hello.
All right, we're good. One down. All right, well, hi everybody. I'm Andy Yan, and I'm so grateful today to be in conversation with Donna Seto on her wonderful book, Chinatown Vancouver. And I think it's such a remarkable, I think, publication, as I think it really joins a parthenon of stories of Vancouver's Chinatown. I can't help but kind of imagine this as a kind of updated and kind of expanded version of, say, some of the work that Paul Yee did in Saltwater City, and how it kind of joins this, I think, this group of books that really talk about the city of Vancouver. And I also remembered that how I first encountered your work, Donna, and on Instagram, and then going on Instagram and then similarly from that, kind of having an initial kind of reach out from you in I think 2023. I think when this journey was it 2023?
Yeah, it was either then or 2022.
Maybe somewhere around there.
Somewhere around there, yeah.
But I think in conversation was just kind of like, okay, well, it's great to meet you, and kind of, well, who are you? And then similarly, it then starts, of course, in Vancouver. When anybody who, I think often you learn of somebody who lived and grew up in Vancouver, the first question you ask is, so where'd you go to high school? And so in this kind of conversation, I'm just going to start. So, Donna, where did you go to high school?
Well, Andy, I think I know where you went to high school, judging by that that jersey that says 93 Van Tech on it.
Thank God it still fits.
But yeah, I went to school at Van Tech as well. Andy and I didn't go to school at the same time. I mean, I think we missed each other. We missed each other literally by months. When I found out you graduated in 93, I was actually going to go back to my grade 8 annual.
Actually, I did. I was looking at my grade 12 annual, like SC. Oh, okay. No. I think we just missed each other.
Yeah, thank God you didn't see that photo. But I was like, I'm gonna look through this annual, because we used to get, I don't know if you high school students still get those, but like the yearbooks. And I was gonna find this photo and actually put it on the slides, right? Not tell you about it. But again, we missed each other by a couple months. But yeah, like I went to Van Tech in East Vancouver in the 1990s, I guess to date myself a bit. But I think you kind of have to, given the remembering Chinatown. But which is funny because when I did a number of interviews for this book because I really wanted to capture the stories, and you can't really capture the stories of Chinatown without actually talking to people and again, not just people who, it's a combination of people who still work in Chinatown, but also people who might have grown up in Chinatown as children, but they or didn't even grow up in China, but their parents or their grandparents had restaurants or they grew up in China. So it's almost like kind of borrowing from the memories of these children and their parents or grandparents aren't there anymore. So it's almost kind of remembering that. But the first question a lot of people asked me, which I thought was kind of hard, which I thought was kind of funny, was like, what high school did you go to? And it's been a while since I went to high school, and I've done other things since. And it was just kind of like weird because having to think back, like, what high school did you go to? And it was kind of funny because once I said Van Tech, like something sparked in a lot of them because they're like, oh, I went to Van Tech too, or I went to Templeton, or I went to Gladstone. And then, okay, now that I know what high school you go to, this is safe. We can talk now, right? So it was almost like that kind of, and I imagine like, as you looked at, school, like the structure in Vancouver in the 90s or even the 80s and before, like it was quite divided. A lot of people in Chinatown and who grew up in the Strathcona and the east side, like they didn't go to school on the west side, like, so it's quite different too. So if I said if I told them my credentials, which is what people normally ask me, and you're kind of like, talking about different schools you went to, various places, I don't think they would have talked to me in the way they did. And they wouldn't have felt safe kind of telling me about their experiences in Chinatown. But, and it was kind of, and I thought that was kind of interesting for me too when I said Van Tech, and they're like, it was all kind of like, yes, we're the same. And you get that a lot in Chinatown too, because with the clan associations, like the same last name, you're kind of part of that family, right? So I felt kind of part of that family being from East Van, and it's been a while since I kind of felt that, right?
I think that upon that kind of identification that you two were, are they still? I think that I forgot the school mascot.
It was a talisman.
Talisman?
Is that still a thing these days?
Is that still a thing? I don't know.
I know at SFU they got rid of them, right?
Yeah, they got rid of them.
Andy and I also went to SFU.
Yeah. There's a strange kind of parallel in our lives, right? I mean. So what did you study at SFU?
Political science and history.
I was political science and geography. So, there's this kind of feeling that, the whole like Marvel universe, multiverse movie thing that, maybe this is like the multiverse kind of coming out, and, that maybe Donna is a variant of me, or maybe I'm a variant of Donna. So that this kind of strange convolution of where the universe has kind of come in together.
Did you read Kevin Chong's book?
I didn't.
Because that's how he talks about that, right?
And it's kind of neat that in your book that you have this entire like Parthenon of writers, of Chinese Canadian writers, really talking about the importance of Chinatown and really the contribution that your book has done to that entire genre. And it's really neat to kind of see that. But I guess mixed into that discussion of high schools, I was wondering, it's kind of speaking about the kind of influences. Who are your favorite teachers?
I think there might be one in the audience. I heard
one? Is there one in the audience? Is there one? Daryl, I think Daryl Wong said he may be popping in. Oh.
Well, I guess. Oh.
Is he?
There
There he is. There he is.
Well,
Mr. Daryl Wong. Who was at Tech between myself and?
Yeah, we had.
Donna.
Well, I mean, I'm going to say that Daryl Wong was my favorite teacher because...
For Mr. Wong?
Mr. Wong was my favorite because being a social scientist, I was excellent at chemistry. But Mr. Wong taught chemistry and math, and I was amazing at... No, I wasn't. Like, I had a really bad mark in math and chemistry. Yeah, I don't know. Mr. Wong was definitely one of my favorite. Mostly, I think a lot of it because we didn't see very many Chinese Canadians who were kind of like us when I was in school, right? Like, right, even when you were in school too, right? Like, and even when I was in my undergrad, I don't think any of my professors were in political science anyway. I don't remember. There was one, like my honor supervisor was Japanese. He's Japanese. But he was Japanese he did undergrad in Kyoto. But there weren't very many Chinese Canadians who we can really identify with, and definitely Mr. Wong was one of them. And he was just great. And I think, I'm not saying that because you're sitting there. I actually mean it. A couple other ones. Obviously, my favorite were my art teacher. And again, I did art in high school because I really loved it, and it was really just one of those things. But I didn't really know what I could do with it because I actually wanted to go to art school. And I almost finished my portfolio for Emily Carr. But it came down to like my parents, as I kind of mentioned, they're immigrants and they're working class. And it was kind of like, what are you going to do with an art degree? What are you going to do with a fine arts degree? Right? Like I wanted to, draw cartoons and all those kind of things and tell stories. But it came down to art school. It's actually very expensive. We looked at the tuition, like the materials back in 1998, 99 was like $5,000 themselves. Like, I don't know what it is now, but I think it's quite expensive now. Like, and that was just materials, right? And so for like a working class kid, we couldn't afford that kind of stuff. So, off to university, go get a real job kind of thing. So, I studied political science. I was thinking about going into the public service. To my parents' disappointment, I went to grad school. And I kept going to grad school. And then, I never left school. And,
But I remember when we were in the kind of pre-interview, we talked about the various kinds of characters that were over at Vancouver Technical, I think.
Yeah, there were a few. There's one. Do you remember Mr. Emerson?
That was a big dude.
Our social studies teacher, and I loved social studies. He was super scary. I think he was retiring that year.
He was giant.
He was giant. And he was like this really scary guy. But I think the story was, he taught me a lot. The one story I remember from him, because he used to be a cop, and he used to be a cop in the downtown east side. And the one thing he taught us was never really judge who you see on the streets. Because he was telling us this story about, he was just working that day. I think it might have been Oppenheimer Park or Crab Park. I forget the exact details. But he found someone on the park bench, and he was just out of it. And he was like, "What are you doing here? Can I help you?" Yeah, the usual things cops do. And then it turns out he found out a little bit about why this guy was there, and it turns out that he was once a dentist, and he was a dentist in Edmonton. And one day he came home from work from the office, and he saw that his whole house was on fire, and he lost his wife and his 2 kids, and he just didn't know what to do. He kind of just ended up coming to Vancouver, and he ended up in the downtown east side, and totally depressed and not really knowing how to carry on with life. And I think learning that when you're 15 or 16, as Mr. Emerson taught us, really makes you think about a neighborhood differently, right? It made me see how these people are human beings, and they have a life before how we see them, right? And each and every single person, there's a reason why they're there, right? And I think learning this when you're a teenager, I think it has guided me in my research and my areas, human rights and people. So yeah, it did have that impact on me.
And I think talking about influences in your life, you've mentioned another kind of key question to ask is, so you mentioned your parents in about grad school. So what did they think of the book?
It's interesting. Like my parents, like they don't speak English. Like they came here when they're in their early 30s from a village just close to Toisan in Guangdong. And it's interesting kind of building on that connection, because that's where the early Chinese in North America came. So in a lot of Chinatowns, you would kind of hear that Toisan accent, right? And so that's where my parents came from. So it's kind of, even though they came here in the early 1980s, there's still that connection. And then, I only recently learned that a lot of the buildings, like where my parents grew up, were like paid for and funded by like overseas Chinese people. So my great grandfathers on my mom's side, they also went overseas to work and left the family, like many of the early Chinese who came to North America. But they went to Southeast Asia. They went to Malaysia and Thailand, and so. They sent money home to kind of build. And my mom's house, my grandmother's house in China is like this amazing, majestic house, right? And there is that kind of connection there. But how my parents see the book, and I think this is why it's kind of interesting, kind of touching, kind of building together the visuals and the text. Like they're not able to read the text, which is kind of sad in many ways, because they would read it in Chinese, but I don't know how to read Chinese, and I don't really know how to speak it very well. but they're able to look at the photographs and the paintings, and when it's interesting, kind of like, you know, I've shown them my academic work, and they're kind of like, I don't want to look at that. Like, but they like, when they see these visuals, they're like, all of a sudden these conversations start. They're like, oh yeah, I went shopping there. That's so and so shop. Oh, that's no longer there anymore. And it's interesting kind of listening to their conversations over the years at the dinner table, because they would come home from Chinatown, because they still go there to the bank and to the doctor's still there, and kind of, and they would say that, you know, so and so shop's not there anymore. Where did they go? Like, and it's kind of this kind of loss of a place, right? And so I mean, they like the book in that way, because you can kind of see things and kind of talk about things.
But I think that within that kind of seeing what Chinatown looked like, I'm curious about how you think about what are the kind of lessons from Chinatown in terms of its history and in terms of what it means to Vancouver today.
Yeah, I think I guess touching upon one thing, again, going back to my parents, I mean, one thing I really enjoyed about doing the research about Chinatown, and again, this comes back to what I talked about initially, like, I never saw myself in history. I never saw myself in the politics I spent years studying. I actually I started focusing on Chinese politics of China and Japan, because I was trying to find myself, because I couldn't find myself in Canada, right? And then I realized I had nothing to do with China or Japan, really, and I couldn't find myself there either. But it's interesting when you're kind of looking at the details of Chinatown's history. Like, there was this interesting generation kind of in the 60s and the 70s, and they're that Canadian-born Chinese group that were really trying to find themselves. And there was that first generation that was able to have that choice of actually being, they didn't have to live in Chinatown or work in Chinatown. And yet, you know, they're trying to also break away from their very traditional parents, like my parents, like, they don't speak the language very well. It kind of depended on Chinatown as that connection. So that, you know, being able to kind of learn from them and kind of build on that identity has been really important. I guess another thing I've probably learned lessons about Chinatown is just how adaptable people are. Like, I see my parents now, and I see a lot of people in Chinatown, and the conversations that I have, even though, you know, it could be a skateboard shop, or it could be, you know, a forum who sells appliances, like, there is this sense of willingness to adapt and their resilience. And, you know, we hear, you know, the sad parts about how things are changing, and just people aren't paying attention or coming down. And, you know, when you talk about tariffs and the economy, the people in Chinatown feel it exponentially more, right? So, and I think, but then at the same time, you also see the ability to kind of reinvent themselves. Because for example, like Dollar Meats, they've been there for over 50 years. And I remember going there as a kid, and it's just this butcher shop. Actually, I showed a photo of it. And you see this, and I recently started following their Instagram, and their Instagram is so much better than mine. Like, they have like these videos, and they're talking about their history, and it's amazing. Like, and so you kind of see that ability to kind of adapt and modernize, right? Like, it's not, when you think about Chinatown, it's not, and it's never been like a static place. It's always been dynamic. There's always been differences politically, economically, gender, like all these things. And yet, sometimes when it's kind of portrayed in the media or in mainstream, it's always kind of this monolithic, static place, right? But you kind of look at, and when you talk to the everyday people, you realize how, like, diverse they are, and how just resilient and adaptable they are. And it's kind of, I think that's one thing that kind of strings through history I've noticed.
Is the sense of resilience and adaptability.
Yeah, like, and just, like, I mean, I don't want to, like, I find they're willing to, like, take the opportunities, right? Like, I think both you and I kind of know, growing up in the same way, like, when we have to keep our heads down, we do keep our heads down. But at the same time, we adapt. We learn to adapt, right? Like,
Yeah.
like.
No, I think the part of it is also, there's also a point in your life where you just got to go for it. You just got to just hope for the best and just charge on forward, which I think some of the kind of aspects of any immigrant coming to Canada has that kind of perspective, and how places like Chinatown, spaces like Chinatown, but then also other neighborhoods throughout the city has kind of offered that type of foundation, and I think that's I think really is, I think some of the if there's a power of place in like places like Chinatown certainly comes in. Oh, sure. But it's just me riffing off about the power of place. But then I think within this kind of discussion, I think within your book, I'm curious within the many wonderfully illustrated buildings, which ones are your favorite?
Oh, my favorite? Well, my favorite is the one you bought, which is the first Chinese Freemasons building, which is the one on West Pender and Carroll. Like, it's just a beautiful building, right? Like, I think, and there's so many different things going on with it, and like, it has the balconies, and it has this, like, it's not really like you would think of a Chinese building, and I don't really know what a Chinese building look like, but it is one of those buildings that's just really cool. I think that one's probably my favorite that I've done. Yeah, I think that one would be it. Like, I think. I don't know why. I don't know. I don't have any connections to that building whatsoever, but I think just painting it, I think I really liked it in that way.
Most importantly, it's actually my niece's favorite drawing in your book. That is it's also their favorite colors, teal and purple. But I think that what's neat about I don't know if folks are familiar with the Freemasons building in Vancouver's Chinatown over at Pender and Carroll. That its unique aspect of its architectural construct is that on the Pender side is what's kind of traditional southern Chinese architectural types, and particularly recessed terraces. But yet on the Carroll side is a traditional Italianate facade. To kind of see the two different, I think, faces. It has two unique faces of the Freemasons back then, and it's kind of neat to kind of show how it kind of saw itself as part of both worlds, which is part of the reason why it's one of my favorites too.
Yeah, and I guess there's arguments about that too.
Yeah.
But I like that interpretation of that building, and I think I kind of see Chinatown that way, and its relationship with Vancouver, right? Like, it's multifaceted. There's different faces, there's different parts of it, and the great thing about all these buildings throughout Chinatown, and I'm not an architect or urban planner like you, but kind of learning from these buildings, you see how versatile they all are, right? They started off as just like buildings, for other societies or like various reasons, and some of them, actually one of them was like a theater. Yep. And I would never have guessed that was a theater for Cantonese opera back in the day. And then it just evolved into like, and the cool thing about the theater one, it actually evolved to like, include box offices and like different kind of tiered seating, and how the class kind of changed in Vancouver or in Chinatown, but also it evolved to be like a dormitory, and now it's an office. And now the Dragon Boat Festival's in there now. Like, so it's like you see all these different buildings, and they kind of evolved over time. Like, some of them are restaurants, and some of them are like, they become like nightclubs. So you see how the Chinatown actually switched and changed over the hundreds of years.
I don't know if folks are familiar with the architect kind of writer, Stuart Brand. He writes about buildings that learn, and I think that Vancouver's Chinatown has so many examples of buildings that have kind of seen many lives over time, and yet didn't necessarily need to be demolished. And I think that that's a kind of one aspect of the kind of buildings in Vancouver's Chinatown. I think there's one over 251 East Pender.
I'm trying to interrupt you because this mic is not very loud for whatever reason.
We can pass this one.
See if that
Oh,
works
good.
better.
251 Pender, which is where Cam Wai Dim Sum is. And if you ever have a chance, you gotta come in and pop by Cam Wai for a bun or for some dim sum. But it was where my dad's dim sum parlor was way back in the day. The Guangzhou restaurant that when I showed him photos of your drawings, it just kind of really kind of made him kind of reminisce about how he got the start in Vancouver's Chinatown, and it was absolutely fantastic to kind of see his reaction. But I think that within this discussion of like favorite buildings, I'm curious, what are some of the stories that you think kind of come out of the buildings that, or even just kind of in over the course of your research did you have?
Yeah, I mean, there were so many different stories. Actually, one of them, it's in the book, and it's probably one of my favorite stories. And it's actually a building that's actually not like in your traditional Chinatown. So this is the China Arts and Crafts, and it was actually on Hastings. And it has a really neat history because it was Wally Lee's. So I interviewed his daughter. Wally Lee's no longer here anymore, but I interviewed his daughter, Karen Lee, who's a film director. And it's a really cool story because it talks about this kind of identity evolving amongst the youth in Chinatown during the 60s and the 70s. And it's really cool. It was really neat because they were just trying to find themselves, but they didn't really identify with their parents, right? And so there's this group that started, and then I don't think they've really, some of them haven't even been to mainland China, and so, but they were identifying with the communist movement in China. So I thought that was really interesting. So behind, apparently in the back of China Arts and Crafts, it was like this kind of, they would sell as Maoist paraphernalia. So it was kind of neat that way. And I think the coolest story I got from her was like, in Chinatown, so her father was also the athletics director of the Chinese Freemasons, right? And it was good that he was, because he was getting death threats and everything from the Kuomingtangs. And so you can kind of see how like global politics were actually playing out right in kind of on Pender Street or on Hastings or on Main Street, right? And so in Chinatown, he was getting death threats, and there was this kind of conflict going between the two, because between the Kuomintang and the Freemasons. And at the same time, the funny thing was they lived on the same block in South Vancouver, and their kids played together. So in Chinatown, they hated each other. But in South Vancouver, they're like, their kids are having barbecues together, they're hanging out. Right. And so they kind of put their politics aside. And I think that was kind of that one story that I just remember, kind of affiliated with one of the buildings that's kind of outside China, but it kind of represents all these different, the division in Chinatown, but also the willingness to put that division aside and get together for a barbecue when you need to, right? Like, and also for the next generation, right? So the kids can play together.
So peace through barbecue.
Yeah, I think we should have more barbecues. Like, yeah, I think so.
I love it, but I'm curious within the various images of those particular stories through your book. I'm always curious about the first image that you have in your book, and also the last image that you have in your book, and are there any particular Easter eggs readers should perhaps look for?
Yeah, so the first building I did, and I guess to give people a bit of background, like I never thought I would be writing this book. It just kind of came out accidentally, but I started sketching, and the first building I finished, the first sketch I finished was actually of the bamboo village. That it doesn't really have a name. It's kind of like just a business building, but and then so yeah, that's one of the first buildings, and you'll see that in the first page in the book. That's my first painting. And was it the last building I did?
But the last one, it was a pot of flowers along with a lemon tea.
Oh, well, that's in the acknowledgement. That's the last in the book. But I would have to say the last one I did was probably the book cover. So I did the book cover as well, and also the font. They wanted me to do the font for that. And I didn't know how to do font. I started looking up fonts on Pinterest. And then so we did the cover, and we didn't want one single building. We wanted multiple buildings. So I did kind of part of a block. You see the CBA building, and you see the new Chinese Freemasons building, and you see the ho-ho, and you see the old Marco Polo kind of squished in there with a tiny little block, which is kind of squished, or it's a tiny little street, Columbia Street. So I think that's probably one of the last ones I did. And you can see the styles quite different. So when I first started painting, I had this very cheap set of watercolors. I had it forever, so I started, just using it. And then as I evolved, I bought fancier paints, and you can see how the colors kind of have evolved as well in the paintings.
So I guess over the course of the book, it's the evolution of Donna Seto as an artist.
Yeah, I mean, it's not chronological if you flip through the book, but yeah, you can see how, you can probably tell, I guess that maybe the artistic ones can kind of tell maybe even the different use of materials. And then I bought an iPad last year, so some of the things I've done digitally, like the font, for example, I didn't know how to do it by hand and make it look like and stand out, like on the cover. So I did that using my iPad on Procreate.
Nice. So I think that within that kind of evolution, I guess one thing that I wanted to kind of expand upon, because I remember your description of yourself actually for this event was the last line, being a poet. And I was wondering if you can kind of expand on being a poet.
This wasn't in the script. Well, I mean, actually, this goes back to high school.
Okay.
In high school, I actually really enjoyed writing poetry.
Right.
And I really enjoyed, and it actually goes back to when I was in grade 3. Like my parents didn't know how to read English, and so no one really read to me when I was a kid. And so but I had great librarians in my elementary school, and one of the ones, like one of the first books I
You heard that? Great librarians. Terry Young, the MLA for Vancouver, Yaletown, was here, but he wasn't here. But just remember that. Great librarians.
But I mean, I have to say, now that we talked about school, even going back to like elementary school, like I have to say, like being a kid of immigrant parents, like I remember the first time someone read me a book was my librarian. And I very much remember it was James and the Giant, or James and the Chocolate, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And I didn't actually know how to read it, but she read it to us over and over, and I finally got the chance to take the book out, and I didn't know how to read the words on the page, but I had memorized it, and that's kind of how I learned how to read. And I think that's why it's important about librarians. But yeah, coming back to poetry, like that was probably there was this great poetry section in my elementary school. And yeah, I took some of the books out. And the great thing about poetry is that the lines are short, right? But then you also realize how much is packed in the lines, and it's so beautiful. So yeah, when I was a kid, I really enjoyed reading and writing poetry. I think even during my undergrad or during high school, I did a lot, and during my undergrad. But since I started, there's something to do with graduate school that doesn't give you room to do anything.
It kind of beats the creativity out of you?
It does, yeah. I never wrote any poetry or really did any art in grad school. Yeah. I haven't done much since I was working as well. So, but yeah, I've always wanted to be a poet because I think there's something beautiful about that language, like being able to kind of capture things in these lines, and I think it is that one thing that it's like therapy, and it really captures emotions and histories and relationships, like in these short sentences, not even like short phrases.
So I'm curious that we go back to that 16-year-old Donna at Vancouver Technical, in between classes to Mr. Wong's math class. What would you tell her after this book and we're talking about Chinatown? What would you tell that young Donna?
I would tell that young Donna that it's okay, your math mark wasn't so great, and your chemistry mark wasn't so great, but yeah, keep focusing on your art. And also, like, it's interesting too, coming from like another story from high school that's really impacted me is like actually one of my English teachers in high school, like, I wrote an amazing essay, and she called me up in front of the class and asked me if I wrote it. Right. And so those are the kind of things that, and when she asked me that, she was like, I didn't think someone like you can actually write this way. Those are those moments when you're so young that really impacts you, right? And through the whole time, she was really nice to me afterwards when I told her I did write that essay, and I continued to write really good things, but it stays with you. The fact that I'm talking about it right now, 30 years later, like, I think it, and when I talk to kids these days, like, they're asking these questions, like, what experiences do you remember when you were my age? And that's one of the things, right? Like, kind of like
being told that you can't write a certain way or do a certain thing because of the way you look, right? And I think, and I got it also a lot being a political scientist. Like, you have to read and you write a lot. And at conferences and stuff like that, you kind of get asked all the time. And your background is kind of urban planning, and you did your master's and I learned your undergrad honors on Chinatown, but my research wasn't on Chinatown. It's on children's rights and sexual violence and conflict.
Right.
So it's a very different topic. And whenever I talk about those things, I always get, at one conference, one of my first conferences, I got asked, it was about Amur Asian children, so children who are half white, half Vietnamese, who grew up during the or after the Vietnamese War, who got left behind by the Americans. Someone came after I gave a conference paper about that. Someone came up to me and asked me, "Are you one of those children?" So there's that sense like that because you look a certain way, you're kind of aligned to your research in that way, and that you can't be valid in talking about it as a researcher.
The whole aspect of, I think they called it me-search.
Yeah, research.
And how somehow me-search is somewhat of a lesser field than research. And no, that's an interesting kind of thought. But then I think in your experience as a political scientist, as an academic, I think how has this kind of, I think writing a book like this kind of changed or adjusted your own kind of thoughts of what you do now?
Yeah, that's a very good question too. Again, also off script.
Sorry, scripted questions kind of terrible. I'm just like, oh,
this is good.
Free mic this.
I mean, and it goes back to like how we teach things in university and what we value and what we don't value, right? Like in political science, I think if my colleague, like my politics colleagues, saw that I drew and wrote this way, it's kind of discredited.
Really?
Yeah, like, and if you read some of my other stuff, if you read my other book, you don't have to read it. It's boring. Like it's just in a university library. Every now and then I might get an email from a graduate student. But here I'm able to talk about like a neighborhood that's different, right? And I'm able to talk about to different people, right? And I think it becomes more accessible, whereas like academic stuff becomes so convoluted that I'm only really talking to my 5 favorite friends, right? Now I get to talk to like, I don't know how many people are in this room, like 200 people. Like, so, and it's nice. And I feel, and it's interesting too, like I think about it a bit, like politics is not a very nice field. Yeah. It's very argumentative. It's very, and I felt when I was doing it, like you felt really stressed out and really kind of angry. But whereas when I'm doing research about this, I'm drawing these paintings, I felt a lot more connected to like the community and to something that I'm actually, working or it's a place that I actually value, right? It's a place I grew up in. And I think, whatever university education looks like, I think it should create more room for creativity and things like this, because I think these topics aren't just academic topics. They involve the whole community and different people and like interdisciplinary research, as we say. But like, but yeah, like I think we need to hear out, the community and the different voices in order for us to do something about it.
Because I think that over the course of this conversation, I also see the kind of role of institutions, both in your early life up until your current life in terms of being at a university and how it's kind of shaped yourself. And I'm curious about your thoughts about how those institutions change. I mean, sounds like sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but I'm curious about your thoughts about the role of institutions in your life.
In my life, and I mean, when you talk about institutions, I also think about, the institutions that created like certain discriminatory laws that excluded Chinese, and then let them in or give them the right to vote, right? Like, and also like it's interesting too. You talk about universities, because I think about a couple of the cases in Chinatown, like the Wongs at Modernized Tailors, like Bill and Jack, like. They went and got engineering degrees at UBC, but they weren't able to practice engineering. They had to go back to their father's shop at Modernized Tailors, and that's where they worked, right? And so you kind of, when I think about that, like, working at a university, I think about how we're teaching or caring for the students, and are we kind of preparing them for the right roles in the field? And thinking about these cases is interesting too, because like, sure, they can get a degree, but will they be able to find jobs afterwards, right? And they weren't. And there's a few cases in the book that kind of cover that, right? And so, and yeah, the institutions and that connection. I think I've had a number of times where when I was teaching, a couple years ago when I was teaching this class on children in conflict at UBC, a number of the students came up to me afterwards and said, "So it's so nice to see a woman teaching in politics, but also a woman of color teaching in politics," because they've never had that, right? And it's slowly changing now. But again, I teach as a sessional. I'm not a full-time faculty member when I teach. And so a lot of us do kind of take on kind of like contract roles because we're still not given that permanency.
Right.
Even when in meetings, we're not taken seriously because we're women or we're colored, right? Like, so you do, I mean, even in 2025 as a, these conversations are still there. We're still having, we literally had this conversation the other day, right? Like at work. So.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Well, I think just watching the time, we also wanted to kind of open up for audience questions. And Jorge, how are we going to do this? We have a few questions. Okay, how's this? We don't have a roving mic, but if I point to you and just speak loudly, the person in front here.
Yeah, actually, I get that a lot about the watercolor comment. So I guess your first question, did I do it on location? No, I didn't. And mostly because I'm capturing them at different times. And so a lot of times I looked at photographs online, but I love looking at photographs throughout the archives. And also the Vancouver Public Library has a great, I'm not trying to plug it, but some of the photographs in the book are from the Vancouver Public Library historical collection. And they have this great collection of historical photographs. And so you can look at them. Just go to the archives, Vancouver Archives or VPL, and you can look them up. And so I used a lot of the black and white photographs, and a lot of the times because there's not that many photographs of Chinatown, and for various reasons people didn't take photographs, and people who could take photographs didn't take them in Chinatown. So there's very few early photographs of Chinatown. There's more kind of in the 50s going onwards. And then Paul Yee did an amazing job kind of collecting all these different photographs and kind of documenting that for Chinatown. So a lot of times I did it based on archival photographs, but also kind of combining the different ones to kind of capture the different times. And I think coming back to your second question about watercolor, I think that's the beauty of watercolor. Like if anyone who does watercolor, it's a transparent medium, right? And so you can kind of layer it on, and you can never really, if you're mixing different colors, you can't ever really get the same color twice, and even on one part of the building, it might be the one color, and it kind of evolves in a different. So I think that's the beauty about kind of using watercolor to kind of illustrate Chinatown, because you can kind of see the variances and also the different layers of paint.
There's a question in the back, the gentleman in the blue.
Hi there, my name is Chilwin Chang.
Oh,
Hey, Andy.
hey.
And Dr. Seto, thanks for shouting out my shout out your book on LinkedIn. I appreciate that. I say that as a preface to say I came to Canada and Vancouver in 1974. I grew up in the Chinatown that you described. And 30 years later, I'm a prosecutor at 222 Main Street, and I would still go to Gameloft for my lunch breaks. It's a wonderful book, so thank you for producing it. My question, particularly those of us who grew up in Gladstone, Van Tech, if your parents, if you're lucky to have parents who are professionals, you went to Churchill. I'm sure many people smiled because you know that stereotype. For those of us that grew up in that era, is Chinatown destined to be a museum, or is Chinatown destined to be the place for the future? And if there is a place for the future, is it a future for those that went to Richmond post-1986, that went to the West Side post-2000, or is it a place for the Chinese diaspora that did come in the 70s and the 60s? And is that our future?
Right. That's a very good question. I think about that a lot. I'm sure Andy thinks about that a lot. And I think I would say I hope that Chinatown is for everybody, not just
the Chinese who came here in the 70s, or like my parents. And I say this because, and it's interesting with this project and kind of looking at my evolution as an academic and kind of what I studied, and because there wasn't voices and people like me in the texts and in the case studies that I studied, and as a result, I actually rejected being Chinese. And that's why I recognize it now. I don't speak my language very well. It's very sad, right? And I think if I were to tell anybody and why they should come to Chinatown, whether you're, you grew up here, or if you're like, a new immigrant and you like Richmond more, you prefer Richmond. I think everybody needs to understand the origins of this history. And I think there's so much value in it, even if you didn't necessarily grow up in it or didn't necessarily come. And I say this too because I'm actually very proud of this book on a personal level, because I've had to like learn about my culture through it. Like even like, coming back to your question about nuggets in the book, there are food guides in the book, right? Like, and I used to go to dim sum when my aunt was around still, and my parents, and she would tap the table with her. I didn't know why she did that, right? And then if you're my parents in that generation, they just like, we just do that. We're not going to tell you why, right? Like it's just like, and my parents always tell me that. So you never really know why. They don't pass this knowledge down. But I had to like look it up on the internet. I had to do all the research. And I think saying that, I think there's this sense of relearning who you are. And I think, having done this book, on a personal level, it has made me more proud of being Chinese Canadian, a certain kind of Chinese Canadian, right? Like I'm trying to find my place in it too. And I hope whether you're grew up here and you grew up on the east side and you went to Gladstone, I'm assuming you went to Gladstone, or Van Tech, or if you grew up in Churchill, if you're trying to find yourself, I think it's a way to do so. I think it's a way to be proud of certain things, and also being a way of being proud of the multiculturalness of it, right? Like it's this mixture of different things. So I hope everyone kind of is able to learn from China. And the cool thing is, like last semester, I was teaching a group of graduate student civil engineers. I'm not an engineer myself. And I brought them down to Chinatown. We hired John Atkin for a tour. He taught them all these things about the Georgia Viaduct and the ground underneath Pender there, and the ground underneath the Andy Livingstone Park and all this kind of stuff. And the question I got from them, and 21 out of the 22 students in that class have never been to Chinatown. A lot of them are international students. A lot of them live in Richmond. A number of them are Chinese background. And they came up to me afterwards and they said, why did they do this to Chinese people? I'm Chinese. Why did they do this to Chinese people? And we're engineers. What can we do to help Chinatown do better? And so these are my students who didn't have any connection to Chinatown whatsoever. They never even been to Chinatown until I made them come down here, go to Chinatown. So they're seeing that value, and I hope other people see that value as well.
Okay, the person right there.
What happened to the original location of Ming Wo on Pender?
So is there an original? They're in that same building, weren't they?
Mingwo is, well, that was their original building.
Yeah.
And then, but they still have, I think, was it one or two more? They have two more locations. Yeah. Yep.
But the original location was just beautiful.
Absolutely gorgeous. And should anybody have $4 million available, it is now apparently available for sale. So.
I mean, still the building's still there. Still
it's
has
gorgeous.
the sign. I think afterwards, Massey Books, Massey Arts was in there for a while, kind of as an arts kind of center. And now it's I think it's a vintage store.
I think so.
I think recently it's a vintage store, I think.
One more. The gentleman over there. Yes, you sir.
Political science grad here. So your remark about power and privilege of publishing kind of resonated with me. Made me think of Howard Zinn's People's History
Right.
of the United States. So now with technology, we can overcome that barrier. We have more democratization of being able to tell stories. What I'd like to get your comment about is that in being able to still not have the sort of mental barriers represented by those squares where not understanding that the stories of the separate communities are actually part of the overall story of Canada. And people, they look at maybe your book and say, oh, this is a Chinese story, this doesn't apply to us.
Those are great questions, and I mean, ultimately, I hope, and that's interesting about the publishing industry, right? Like it is, at least the traditional publishing industry, is they're gatekeepers, right? And they're still defining who can publish based on who the readers are, and as I mentioned, like historically, people like me weren't being able to publish, or if we do publish, we're publishing Asian stories. And I hope this book doesn't get pegged as just an Asian story, because when I look at Chinatown, it's about, or the history of Chinatown, it is the history of Vancouver and also the history of Canada. And when you kind of go into the, the details in the book, I also include like Tulsi's, which is like the Italian grocer on Main Street, and also the history of the Italians in China, like kind of in Strathcona and also that border of Chinatown, but also
Hogan's Alley?
Sorry?
Hogan's Alley, I think.
In Hogan's Alley. And so when we look at Chinatown, it's called Chinatown because that's what people identify it with, but also it's about, a community where people started, right? And so when we also look at the Italians, they had parallel experiences of building the railway, and also were discriminated by the bigger group. And when we look at, I don't think it should be like a racialized thing, but also kind of understanding kind of how Vancouver was divided, but also how certain groups were able to kind of break out of it too, right? And when you look at I think the previous question about kind of the differences in how we were brought up as Chinese Canadians, we're so different, right? And Andy and I have similarities, but we're also very different, right? In many ways,
so.
right? And same with, I don't think I have much in common with people who just came here. Right, but when we think about the fabric of a Canadian story, and this is the beauty of illustrations and stories, but also literature and poetry and art, right? We're able to kind of capture all these different experiences and kind of communicate it in a way where people might be able to resonate and understand it.
Okay, I think that we're now out of time for questions, but I should note that as of today, Donna's book is a bestseller on Amazon.
Shop local.
Strangely, in the preservation of art. So a win's a win, okay? Win's a win. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for everybody coming. Again, books are available for purchase over to my right, and then Donna will be available to sign on my left. And thank you so much. I'd like to thank the Vancouver Public Library. Wonderful event. Thank you, Jorge. And we're done. Thank you.
Thank you.